The morning Raymond Thatcher's quiet life ended, and his real life arrived wrapped in a thin October mist, the kind that settled low over the Kansas plains in 1878 and turned the prairie into something halfway between a dream and a painting. He was standing at his cookstove with a tin cup of coffee going cold in his hand when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a wagon wheel giving up on life. It was a grinding, splintering crack that cut clean through the silence, followed by the slow groan of wood and iron settling wrong, and then nothing but the wind again. Raymond set his cup down on the rough-hewn table, pulled on his coat, and walked out the front door into the pale gray light without hurrying, because a man who has lived alone for 4 years on the eastern edge of the Kansas Flint Hills learns to move without urgency when urgency does not yet require him. What he found at his fence line stopped him where he stood. A wagon had come off the old Caldwell Road and turned down the rutted track that ran along the western edge of his property, and it had made it exactly 20 yards past his split-rail fence before the rear axle snapped. The wagon sat tilted hard to the left, its back corner buried in the damp earth, the wheel splayed out at a broken angle like a wounded animal. The 2 draft horses were standing patiently in their traces, breath clouding in the cold air, utterly unbothered by the whole affair in the manner that only horses and old men can manage. Standing beside the wagon, hands on her hips, jaw set with the particular kind of determination that does not ask for help but knows when it needs it, was a woman. She was perhaps 32, maybe 33, with dark auburn hair that had been pinned up in the night and was now falling loose in ways she had not yet had time to address. Her dress was practical dark wool, road-dusty and travel-worn, and she wore a man's canvas coat over it that was 2 sizes too large for her. Her boots were good ones, Raymond noticed, which told him something. A woman who kept good boots in hard times was a woman with sense. Behind her, peering over the side of the tilted wagon bed, were 3 boys. The oldest looked to be around 10, with his mother's auburn coloring and an expression that suggested he had already appointed himself in charge of the situation. The middle boy was perhaps 7, round-faced and serious. And the youngest, hanging over the sideboard with wide, curious eyes, could not have been more than 4 years old and appeared to find the whole catastrophe enormously entertaining. Raymond walked to his fence, lifted the gate latch, and stepped through into the track. "Morning," he said. The woman turned to face him, and he saw in her eyes, dark green and steady as a summer creek, that she had already sized him up and made several decisions about him before he had finished crossing the distance between them. "Morning," she said. Her voice was clear and measured, not apologetic, not distressed. "My rear axle has broken. I am aware that I am on the edge of your property and I apologize for the inconvenience. If you could direct me to the nearest town, I would be grateful and we will be out of your way." Raymond looked at the wagon. He looked at the axle. He looked at the 3 boys, the 2 horses, the mist-covered prairie stretching in every direction, and then he looked back at her. "Nearest town is Harlow's Creek," he said. 14 miles. A muscle in her jaw moved. "All right," she said. "On foot," he added, not unkindly. "With 3 children, through that." He gestured at the misty open country ahead. She looked in the direction he indicated, and for just a moment, just one brief, honest second, the composure slipped, and he saw what was underneath it. Not weakness. Nothing like weakness. Just the particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding everything together for a very long time and is calculating how much longer they can continue to do so. Then the composure came back, locked into place like a bar across a door. "Then I suppose I will need to see about this axle," she said. "I can fix it," Raymond said. She looked at him. "I did not ask." "No," he agreed, "you didn't. But I'm telling you anyway because the axle can be fixed, and it makes more sense to fix it than to walk 14 miles with 3 children in October." He paused. "My name is Raymond Thatcher. This is my land. I have a forge in my barn and the iron stock to make a new axle pin, and I have done it before." The woman studied him for a moment longer than was comfortable, in the way of someone who has learned to read people carefully because they cannot afford to read them wrong. "Catherine Grady," she said finally. "These are my sons, Eli Thomas, and the small one is Henry." The oldest boy, Eli, gave Raymond a look of frank assessment that was so similar to his mother's it nearly made Raymond smile. Thomas stared at him with his round, serious face. Henry waved from the sideboard with the cheerful openness of a child who has not yet learned caution. "All right, Mrs. Grady," Raymond said. "Let me get my tools." He fixed the axle first. It took the better part of 2 hours. He unloaded the wagon with the help of Eli, who worked without being asked and without complaint, handing down boxes and bundles with careful attention to which ones were fragile. Raymond unhitched the horses and walked them to his paddock, and he could feel Catherine watching him handle them, watching how he spoke to them quietly and gave them water, and he understood she was still deciding about him. The work itself was straightforward for a man with Raymond's skills. He had grown up apprenticed to a blacksmith in Missouri before the war had changed everything, and after the war had changed it further, and there was still a deep satisfaction in working iron that he had never quite been able to explain to anyone. The forge in his barn had been the first thing he built when he came to this land in 1874, before the house was fully chinked, before the roof was sound. He lit it now and let it come to heat while he studied the broken axle, measuring by eye and experience what was needed. Catherine kept the boys out of the barn without making it feel like a restriction. She found a use for each of them. Eli was given the task of inventorying what had come off the wagon to make sure nothing was broken. Thomas was set to refilling the water barrels from Raymond's well with the hand pump, and Henry was simply told to stay where his mother could see him, which he interpreted as permission to follow Raymond's barn cat, a fat orange animal named Biscuit, in wide circles around the yard. Raymond worked at the forge, and through the open barn door he could see Catherine sitting on an upturned crate in the yard with a small leather-bound book open on her knee, writing. Not idle writing. She was working at it, turning pages back to check something, making small neat marks in the margins. He found himself curious about the book and then curious about the curiosity, because he had not been particularly curious about anyone in quite some time. Around the midpoint of the work, when the iron was cooling in the first stage and could not be rushed, he came out of the barn and walked to the house and put together a meal. It was not much cornbread from last night's baking, dried venison that he had been meaning to use, preserved peaches from the cellar, and fresh coffee. He carried it out on a board and set it on the tailgate of the wagon without ceremony. "You should eat something," he said to Catherine. "Children, too." She looked at the food. Something crossed her face that she kept carefully controlled. "Thank you," she said, and the formality of it told him the gratitude was larger than the words. Eli ate like a boy who had been hungry for a while. Thomas ate neatly, with small, precise bites. Henry ate the preserved peaches with both hands and got them on his coat, and Catherine cleaned his face with a dampened cloth from her bag with the automatic efficiency of a mother who has done this 10,000 times. Raymond ate standing at the fence, and they did not speak much during the meal, which suited him fine. "Where are you headed, if you don't mind my asking?" he said when the plates were mostly empty. Catherine set down her coffee cup. "Harlow's Creek," she said. "There is a homestead claim I filed last spring, 160 acres east of the town. I have the paperwork." She said this last part with the specific firmness of a person who has had the paperwork questioned before. "Harlow's Creek," Raymond said. He looked at her. "You're planning to work a homestead claim, alone." "With my sons," she said, and there was a very precise edge to it, like a blade kept so clean it caught the light. "I didn't mean any disrespect," he said. "I know what women can do. I have seen it." She studied him again. "My husband died 14 months ago," she said, not as a confession, just as a fact presented to fill a gap. "Fever. It was quick, which I am told was a mercy." She paused. "I have been in Wichita since then, taking in mending work and selling eggs. I saved enough for the journey and the first season's supplies. The claim was his idea originally, but the work will be mine, and I do not see any reason why that changes anything." "It doesn't," Raymond said simply. She blinked as if she had expected a different response. "I mean that," he said. "This country doesn't care much whose idea something was. It only cares whether the work gets done." After a moment she gave a small nod and he returned to the forge. By early afternoon the axle was done. It was solid work, better than what had been there before, and he felt the quiet satisfaction of it when he set it in place and tested the wheel. He put the wagon back together with Eli's help. The boy had a natural mechanical instinct, watching the process and handing Raymond what he needed before he asked for it. And when it was done, Raymond hitched the horses back up and drove the wagon a short loop around his yard to test the repair. The wheel held. The axle did not sing or groan. It was sound. He climbed down and found Catherine standing beside the wagon, watching him. "It's solid," he said. "Should carry you through without trouble. I'd keep your speed down on the rough sections of road. There are 2 bad stretches between here and Harlow's Creek, one just past the creek crossing at Miller's Ford and one at the hill before town. Take those slow and you'll be fine." She looked at the wheel, then at the axle, then at him. "What do I owe you?" He considered the question. He thought about the way Eli had eaten. He thought about the travel dust on her coat and the way she had written in that ledger book with the concentration of someone making plans she needed to believe in. "Nothing," he said. "Mr. Thatcher, nothing," he repeated. "Iron cost me almost nothing. I had the stock. The time was mine to spend." He met her eyes. "Consider it a neighbor's courtesy. Your claim is east of town, which means we are probably closer neighbors than you realize. The Harlow's Creek settlement is small." She was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet he heard the wind coming down from the north, carrying the first bite of real winter in it, and he thought about those 160 acres east of town, which he happened to know were good land but raw land, land that would need an enormous amount of work before it was livable in any real sense. "Thank you," Catherine said at last. And this time the formality was gone, and in its place was something plain and genuine that was more affecting than any elaborate expression would have been. She called the boys to the wagon. Eli climbed up to the bench with his mother. Thomas and Henry settled in the wagon bed, and Henry turned around to wave at Raymond with his whole arm as if they were old friends, which Raymond supposed they were, in the manner of small children who make friends in 30 seconds and mean it completely. Catherine took up the reins. She looked at Raymond standing at his fence. "Miller's Ford crossing and the hill before town," she said. "Go slow at both," he said. She gave him a nod that was almost a smile, and then she clucked to the horses and the wagon moved forward out of his yard, back onto the track toward the Caldwell Road, and Raymond stood at his fence and watched it until it disappeared into the distance and the October mist swallowed it whole. He stood there longer than was strictly necessary. Then he went inside and tried to remember what he had been doing before the axle broke, and found that he could not, and that this bothered him in a way he did not fully understand. 3 days passed, and then a week, and Raymond went about his work in the way a man does when he is trying not to think about something. He checked his fences in the cold mornings and split wood in the afternoons, and cooked his solitary meals and read by lamplight in the evenings, and told himself the silence was exactly what he had always wanted. It was not until the 2nd week that he rode into Harlow's Creek for supplies and heard the news. He heard it at Bellamy's General Store, from old Marcus Bellamy himself, who had opinions about everything and the leisure to express them at length. "That Grady woman got her claim all right," Marcus said, wrapping Raymond's coffee and salt in brown paper. "Got out there and set up camp on the land itself. Her and those 3 boys in a canvas tent, not even a cabin started. 2 or 3 townsmen offered to help her get a proper roof up before winter, and she thanked them and told them she had a plan and would manage." He shook his head. "Stubborn as a Missouri mule, that one." "Is she making progress?" Raymond asked, keeping his voice neutral. Marcus squinted at him. "How would I know? Nobody's been out there." He paused. "Doc Hendricks rode past the claim road last Tuesday and said he could see smoke, so she's at least not frozen." Raymond paid for his supplies, loaded them into his saddlebags, and then, instead of riding back west toward his own land, rode east. He found the Grady claim without difficulty. The staked boundaries were visible, and there was indeed a canvas tent erected in the lee of a low rise that broke the worst of the north wind, which showed that Catherine Grady had chosen her campsite with more intelligence than most experienced settlers. Nearby, Eli and Thomas were working at something. Raymond could see the unmistakable motions of axe work as he approached, and a small fire burned outside the tent with a pot over it. He heard them before they heard him, and he reined in at the property boundary and called out so as not to startle anyone. "Mrs. Grady." There was a pause, and then Catherine appeared from around the back of the tent, carrying an armful of cut brush. She stopped when she saw him. Something quick moved across her face, something that might have been relief or might have been wariness or was probably both at once. "Mr. Thatcher," she said. He climbed down from the horse. "I was in town for supplies," he said. "Thought I'd check the axle." A beat of silence. They both knew perfectly well the axle was fine. "The axle is fine," she said. "Yes," he agreed. She looked at him steadily. Then, with a decision he could see being made in real time, she set down the brush and said, "I have been trying to figure out the cabin layout. I know what I want, but I have not done this before, and I want to be sure the positioning is right before I start breaking ground." Raymond tied his horse to a stake she had driven into the earth for exactly this purpose, as if she had expected visitors, or at least hoped for them. "Show me what you have," he said. She had a plan. Of course she did. She had sketched it out in the ledger book, the same one he had seen her writing in, with precise measurements, and a compass rose she had drawn herself indicating which direction was north. The cabin was to be dug into the south face of the rise for insulation, with the door facing east to catch morning light. The dimensions were sensible, not oversized, with a good separate corner partitioned for the boys' sleeping area and a storage cellar underneath. "This is good thinking," he said honestly. "My husband was a planner," she said. "I learned from watching him. He was good at the dreaming part." She paused. "I am better at the executing part." Raymond studied the sketch. "You've got your door right, your orientation right. Main thing I'd change is this wall here." He pointed to the north wall of the sketch. "Double it. Chink it twice, and add a layer of sod against the outside. That north wind in January will cut right through single-wall construction like it's paper." She looked at the sketch, then nodded and made a notation. Not a quick scribble, a precise annotation. As if everything she wrote down she intended to use. He stayed for 3 hours. He helped Eli and Thomas with the initial ground clearing, showing the older boy how to read the frost line in the soil and what it meant for foundation depth. He looked at the timber stand at the north end of the property and told Catherine she had enough decent cottonwood and elm for the walls if she was willing to do the cutting and seasoning. "The seasoning takes time," he said. "Green wood will shrink and gap on you." "How much time?" "Ideally 6 to 8 weeks for what you'd use for framing." But in October going into November he stopped. She finished it for him. "In October going into November, 6 to 8 weeks is not a luxury I have." "No," he said, "it isn't." They were both quiet, looking at the land around them. The grass had gone gold and brown with the first hard frosts, and the sky was a pale, bright blue that was beautiful in the way of things that are also dangerous, because that kind of blue in late October in Kansas meant the real cold was coming soon. "There is another option," Raymond said carefully. "You could spend the winter in town, rent a room, come out to the claim in the spring and build properly with seasoned wood." She looked at him with the patience of a woman explaining something to someone who should already understand it. "Mr. Thatcher, renting a room in town costs money I do not have at a rate I cannot sustain. My claim requires that I demonstrate habitation improvements by the spring assessment or I risk losing it. And beyond the legal requirements," she paused. "Beyond the requirements, this is my land. I will be on it." He nodded slowly. He had expected this answer. He was not entirely sure why he had asked the question. "Then we build before the weather turns," he said. She looked at him. "We." "My nearest neighbor to the east," he said, It's practical. Mr. Thatcher, I cannot pay you. I know that. I will not be in debt to anyone, she said, and this time there was real force behind it, the kind that comes from having been in some kind of debt before and knowing exactly what it costs. He thought about it. Then pay me in work, he said, not money. When spring comes and I need extra hands at planting time, you send Eli for a week. That boy has a good head and a strong back and I can use both. That's fair. She looked at him for a long moment. That's very carefully constructed to make me feel like I'm not accepting charity, she said. He met her eyes. Is it working? Another of those almost smiles. Somewhat, she admitted. Good enough, he said. He rode back to his own land and put his horse up and stood in his barn in the early dark thinking about Catherine Grady's sketch in her ledger book, and the way she had drawn the compass rose with such exactness, and the way she had looked at her land, not with fear, not with doubt, but with the focused attention of someone reading a problem they fully intend to solve. He had not thought about a woman in this particular way in a very long time. He noticed it the way you notice a sound you had forgotten existed, startling, and then immediately familiar, like something returning. He was 36 years old. He had been on this land since 1874 after coming out of the war, and then 2 years of aimless drifting that he did not like to examine too closely. He had built something here, something solid and his own, and he had told himself the solitude was the price of it and a reasonable one. His neighbors in the Harlows Creek area were sparse and mostly not to his taste, being either the kind of men who talked too much or the kind who drank too much, and he had not found much middle ground. He thought about Catherine's eyes, the color of them in the cold October light, and the steadiness behind them, and the way they had sharpened with intelligence when she looked at his axle repair. She had understood immediately what he had done and why, and she had given him a nod of genuine recognition that had pleased him more than he had admitted to himself at the time. He fed Biscuit the cat and went to bed and lay in the dark listening to the wind, and told himself he was thinking about nothing in particular. He was back at the Grady claim 2 days later with a wagon load of lumber, properly seasoned pine planking he had in his own stores, more than he needed, originally purchased for barn improvements that he had been putting off. He arrived before noon and found Catherine already at work, she and Eli digging the foundation trench with a methodical rhythm that told him they had been at it since first light. Thomas was watching Henry near the tent, and when Henry saw Raymond's wagon, he made a sound of pure delight and ran toward it, which prompted Thomas to pursue him at a responsible trot, and both boys arrived at the wagon in a small clattering heap. Raymond, Henry announced, as if Raymond might not be aware of his own name. Morning, Henry, Raymond said, climbing down. We are building a house, Henry told him with great importance. I heard, Raymond said. Thomas, more reserved, gave him a serious nod. Mother says we will be inside by the first hard snow, he said. She calculated it. Did she? Raymond said. She calculates everything, Thomas said, with the tone of a child who has learned this is simply a fact of his existence, like weather. Catherine and Eli came over when they saw the wagon. Catherine looked at the lumber. She looked at Raymond. He could see her working through the arithmetic of accepting it versus refusing it. Seasoned pine, he said before she could speak. I had it in my stores. It would have sat there through the winter and warped anyway. Better to use it. This was not entirely true. It was perhaps 1/4 true, which he felt was enough. She pressed her lips together. The Eli arrangement stands. Absolutely, he said. Then let's unload it, she said. They worked together through the day, and something happened in those hours of shared labor that Raymond had not expected, or perhaps had expected but had not allowed himself to prepare for. They fell into an easy rhythm of work, the kind that usually takes months of close association to develop, and had arrived here in a single afternoon. She anticipated where things were going before he moved them there. He understood instinctively which decisions she wanted to make herself, and which ones she would welcome input on, and he stayed on the right side of that line without being asked. Eli worked alongside them with a focused energy that reminded Raymond of himself at that age, and occasionally the boy would ask a question about joinery, about load distribution, about why the sill plate had to sit at a specific height, and Raymond answered each one fully, treating him as someone capable of understanding, which he was. At one point in the afternoon, while they were setting the first of the wall logs, Catherine said without looking at him, "You know what you're doing." "I've built a few things," he said. "Where did you learn?" He set the log into its notch before answering. "Missouri mostly, my father's farm. Then a blacksmith in town let me apprentice when I was 12. He paused. "Then the war taught you to build fast and build it to last because your life depended on whether it held." She was quiet for a moment. "You were in the war." 1862 to 65, he said. "My husband was too," she said. "Different side, I suspect, given Missouri." He glanced at her. "Does that matter to you?" She considered it genuinely, not as a performance. "No," she said. "It was a long time ago, and you were both following what you believed was right, and you were both wrong about some of it and right about some of it, and that seems to me to be true of most wars." She picked up the other end of the next log. "Ready." He took his end. "Ready." They set the log and moved on. By late afternoon, the foundation was framed and the first two courses of wall were up, and Raymond stood back and looked at it and felt the particular satisfaction of seeing something that was going to be solid. "You'll have walls and a roof before the snow," he said. 10 days of work, maybe 12, depending on weather." Catherine looked at what they had accomplished in a single day, and for a moment she let herself look at it without the controlled expression, without the careful management of her own response. She just looked at it, and what Raymond saw in her face was something that moved him because it was so unguarded, a kind of wondering gratitude that she would have been embarrassed to show if she had known he was watching. He looked away to give her the private moment. They ate dinner together that evening around the fire outside the tent. Catherine cooked a simple stew from dried beans and salt pork that was better than Raymond expected, seasoned with something he could not identify. "Sage," she said when he asked. "There is a patch at the northeast corner of the property. I found it the first morning." She paused. "I consider it a good sign. You can't grow much else where sage grows wild, but it means the soil is there and the drainage is right." "That's good reading of the land," he said. "I read everything I can find," she said simply. "I read 3 books on Kansas agriculture before I filed the claim. I found them at the Wichita Lending Library." She stirred the stew. "Some of it was written by men who had never farmed and were theorizing, which is useless. But there was one, a small pamphlet actually, written by a woman who had homesteaded in the Flint Hills in 1869, that was practical and specific and worth reading 10 times. What was her name?" Catherine looked at him with clear appreciation for the question. "Marta Svensson," she said. "She came from Sweden with her husband, and he died the first winter, and she ran the claim herself for 6 years, and by the time she wrote the pamphlet she had the best producing wheat field in the county." The pamphlet was called Practical Considerations for the Kansas Homesteader, and it covered soil preparation, water sourcing, wind management, and how to negotiate with your neighbors for shared labor in a way that preserved everyone's dignity. She paused. "I believe I have been attempting to follow her advice on that last point." Raymond looked at her over the fire. The flames lit her face gold and shadow, and her hair was properly pinned now, the way it had not been at daybreak the morning they met, and she was, he let himself see it plainly, a remarkably striking woman. Not in the way of women who were ornamental, but in the way of women who were complete, who had a full and functioning internal world that you could see working behind their eyes. "You're doing all right at it," he said. She gave him that almost smile again, the one that kept being just short of a full smile, and he found himself thinking that he would very much like to see what happened when it went the full distance. He rode home in the dark with his horse picking the familiar way along the track, and the stars were out in the enormous Kansas sky, sharp and cold and close, and Raymond Thatcher, who had been a careful and self-sufficient man for 4 years, acknowledged to himself with the directness that solitude eventually produces that he was in the early stages of something he had not planned on. He went back over the following days. Not every day. He had his own land to tend, and the work of late fall was real, the endless preparation for winter, but often enough. He came when he could be useful, which was most days, because a cabin being built needs many hands and the boys were willing but small. On the fourth day of building, he arrived to find that Marcus Bellamy had also sent a man out, a young farmhand named Coulter who worked occasionally for the store. Coulter was tall and good-looking in an effortful way, and he had brought a pie from the bakery in town which he presented to Catherine with a broad smile. "From Mabel at the bakery," he said, though his presentation of it suggested a personal investment. "That's kind of Mabel," Catherine said, and set the pie on the wagon tailgate without ceremony and went back to work. Coulter helped with the cabin work, and he was not useless, but he had the habit of narrating his own labor in a way that Raymond found irritating, and which seemed, based on Catherine's expression, to land somewhere between mildly amusing and exhausting. "I tell you, Mrs. Grady," Coulter said at one point, setting a wall log with more flourish than the task required, "it would be a good thing to have a man out here permanent. This kind of work wants a steady male hand." Catherine, who was at that moment using a level to check the accuracy of the wall plate with complete competence, looked up at Coulter. Her expression was mild. "It seems to be getting done," she said. Raymond, on the other side of the wall, did not let himself smile, but it was close. Coulter made several more attempts at conversation throughout the day that Catherine received with perfect politeness and zero encouragement, and by late afternoon he made his excuses and headed back to town. After his horse disappeared down the claim road, Catherine stood up from where she had been working and rolled her shoulders and said, without looking at Raymond, "I am growing very tired of men who look at my land and see a problem to be solved with a husband." "Most of them mean well," Raymond said, which was the diplomatic answer. She gave him a sharp look. "Do you?" He met her eyes. "I mean well," he said. "Whether I mean it the same way they do is a different question." The air between them shifted in a way they both felt and neither acknowledged directly, and then Eli called something about the corner joint and they both moved toward it, and the moment passed into the wood and the work. The cabin was roofed on the 11th day of building, just as Raymond had projected. It was a good sound structure, 30 by 20 feet, with the double north wall he had specified, a proper stone chimney that he and Eli had laid together. The boy had proven to be excellent with stonework, with an eye for fit that was almost uncanny, and a wooden floor over the packed earth that was a luxury Raymond had insisted on, and Catherine had resisted on grounds of expense, and then accepted on grounds of the boy's health. The first night they had a fire going in the stone hearth with the roof solid over it. Catherine sat in the only chair she had, a simple wooden rocker she had brought from Wichita, and looked at the fire. And Eli sat on his bedroll doing something with a piece of rope, and Thomas was asleep already, and Henry had fallen asleep against Catherine's knee, and she had not moved him. Raymond sat on a short stool he had built for the purpose and drank his coffee and watched the fire, and thought that there was something in this room that he had not been in a room with for a very long time. "Tell me about your land," Catherine said quietly, so as not to wake Henry. "How long have you been here?" "Since 1874, he said. 4 years. Alone the whole time." He looked at the fire. "I was married before in Missouri before the war." He paused. "She died in 1863, fever same as your husband as it happens, fast, which I was told was a mercy." He said the last part with the particular care of someone borrowing someone else's language because they know exactly what it costs. Catherine was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not as a formula. As a genuine thing. I came out here after," he said. "I needed something I had to build myself, something where the work was plain and the results were honest." He looked at the stone chimney he and Eli had laid. "Kansas gives you that if nothing else." "It does," she agreed softly. Henry made a small sound in his sleep and shifted, and Catherine put her hand on his hair automatically, the gesture of a mother so embedded in muscle memory it required no thought. Raymond watched her hand on the sleeping child's head and felt something unlock in his chest, quiet and certain, like a door he had thought was sealed simply swinging open. He did not say anything about it. It was not the time. There were many things that were not yet the time, and he was a patient man. He rode home under the cold stars, and this time he did not work at not thinking about anything. November came in earnest, and with it the first real snows, light and fine as powder, blowing sideways off the plains. Raymond continued to ride to the Grady claim several times a week, and his presence had by now achieved the comfortable quality of expected rather than notable. Eli had started greeting him at the paddock without being asked to, taking Raymond's horse as naturally as if this were simply the arrangement. There was much still to do. The cellar needed proper shelving. The north side of the cabin needed the sod berm Raymond had specified, a project that required moving considerable earth in cold conditions. Catherine had her first kitchen garden planned for spring and needed the ground broken and prepared before the freeze went too deep. And Raymond, who was methodical about these things, had also surveyed her timber stand and her water source, a good spring at the northeast corner of the property, near the sage, and had thoughts about both. They talked through all of these things in the evenings after the boys were in bed, sitting by the fire with their coffee, and these conversations were the ones Raymond thought about most on the rides home. She was exceptionally intelligent, with the kind of mind that caught the implications of things 3 steps out and arranged information quickly and exactly. She had read more than he expected and thought carefully about what she read, and she had opinions that were her own, arrived at by her own reasoning, not borrowed from convention. One evening in mid-November she showed him the full ledger book, which turned out to be not just a plan for the cabin but a comprehensive account of her finances, her goals for the claim across a 5-year span, her seed inventory and planting schedule, and in the back, a list that she called simply "Things I Have Not Figured Out Yet." "This one," he said, pointing to an entry, "winter water access, spring may freeze." "Yes," she said, "that's been concerning me. I can help you dig a secondary cistern before the ground freezes hard, fill it from the spring now, cover it with a wooden cap and earth, should carry you through even the worst cold." She wrote it in the plan with the date. He watched her write it and felt again that particular quiet certainty. "You're very organized," he said. "My husband was not," she said without bitterness. "He was good and kind and he loved us, and he had tremendous ideas and very little ability to organize himself. I learned to organize for both of us." She looked at the ledger. "After he was gone, I realized that I had always been doing more of the practical thinking than I had acknowledged to myself. It was not a comfortable realization." "Why not?" She looked up at him. "Because it meant I had been softening the truth of our situation to spare his feelings, and a part of me had known it, and I had chosen comfort over clarity." She paused. "I will not do that again." He held her gaze. "I wouldn't expect you to." The fire snapped and settled. Outside, the wind was working at the corners of the cabin, but the walls held. "Raymond," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the prefix, and they both noticed it, and neither remarked on it. "Why do you keep coming here?" The question was direct and deserved a direct answer. "Because I want to," he said. "That is not particularly informative," she said, but there was something carefully restrained in her voice that told him she knew exactly what he meant. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He set down his coffee cup. "I am not a man who says things before I know what I mean by them. I know what I mean by this, but I also know it has been 14 months since your husband died and 11 days since we met, and I do not believe in rushing anyone, including myself." He looked at her steadily. "So I will keep coming here because I want to, and we will continue to do good work together, and I will let things be what they are going to be at whatever pace they need to be." Catherine looked at him for a long moment. The fire lit her face gold. Henry's crayon drawing of a horse was pinned to the wall behind her, the first decoration in the cabin, and Thomas's reading primer sat open on the table, and Eli's rope project hung from a nail by the door where he had left it that evening. "That is," she said carefully, "one of the most sensible things anyone has said to me in a very long time." He picked up his coffee cup. "I'm occasionally sensible," she laughed. Not the almost smile, not the restrained politeness, an actual laugh, short and genuine, and it transformed her face into something that stopped Raymond's heart for a full second. "Good night, Raymond," she said. He stood and put his coat on. "Good night, Catherine." He said her name deliberately, matching what she had done, and she heard it, and they both let it stand there between them like a thing planted in good soil. And then he rode home through the winter dark with the lamps of the Grady cabin glowing orange behind him for a long time before the distance took them. December arrived, and with it the hard cold, and the calendar of the frontier compressed in the way it always does in winter, when days are short and movement is difficult, and people draw together around heat and light and the shared project of endurance. Raymond had thought he would naturally see less of Catherine in the deep cold, when the roads were rough and the distance between their claims felt longer. Instead, he found he saw more of her, because there was always something to do, and the winter evenings were long, and the Grady cabin had become the kind of place he wanted to be in. Eli had begun to show him things as well as learn from him, which Raymond found he genuinely enjoyed. The boy had been working on a project of his own design, a water-lifting mechanism for the well, a simple lever arrangement that he had sketched out and was building with scrap wood from the cabin construction. Raymond looked at the sketch one evening and realized the boy had independently arrived at a version of a mechanism that was used in actual practice, with only one miscalculation in the lever ratio. He showed Eli the error and the way to correct it, and Eli absorbed the correction instantly and began to revise the sketch. "He is remarkable," Raymond said quietly to Catherine when Eli had taken his project to the other side of the room. "I know," she said with the particular pride of a mother who knows better than to say it too often to the child's face. "He should have schooling," Raymond said, "proper schooling eventually." "I intend to see that he does," she said firmly. Then she looked at him. "There is a school in Harlow's Creek, has been for 2 years. I know, schoolteacher named Doris Henshaw. She is competent and stern, and the children generally learn things." He paused. "Town is 6 miles from your claim." 7.5, Catherine said, with the precision of someone who had already measured it. "But in spring the roads will be passable and I will work out a system." She glanced at Eli. "He is ready for more than I can teach him myself, and I am honest enough to admit it." They sat by the fire in the way they had developed, comfortable and companionable, and charged in the way that companionable things are when both parties are aware of something neither has yet fully said. On a Thursday in mid-December, Raymond arrived at the claim to find Catherine in the doorway with a look on her face that was different from her usual expression, tighter, more guarded. "There was a man here earlier," she said, "from the land office." Raymond came inside. "Who?" "He said his name was Drummond. He claimed there was a discrepancy in my paperwork. He wanted me to pay a filing correction fee of $15, or he said the claim would be flagged." She said this flatly, the way you say something you are still deciding how to feel about. Raymond felt his jaw tight. "Drummond," he said. "He is not from the official land office. He works for a man named Carver who has been trying to aggregate claims in this area for 2 years. He preys on women and recent settlers who don't know the system well enough to know they're being lied to." Catherine's eyes went sharp and still. "I see," she said. "Your paperwork is legitimate," Raymond said. "I know the actual land agent in this district. His name is James Whitfield, and he is an honest man. I can ride to town tomorrow and speak with him, and he can provide you with written confirmation that your claim is in order." "I told Drummond I would have to review the matter and consult with my legal representative," Catherine said. "You have a legal representative?" "I invented one," she said. "His name is apparently Robert Grady, Esquire of Wichita, who is currently unavailable as he is my dead husband's fictitious brother, but Drummond did not know that." Raymond stared at her. "I needed time," she said calmly. I knew something was wrong with what he was saying, but I did not have enough information to challenge him directly. So I created an obstacle and told him to return in 2 weeks. She picked up her coffee cup, which gives you time to speak with the actual land agent. Raymond sat down in his stool by the fire and looked at her. This woman who had in the course of 14 months buried her husband, kept 3 children fed and clothed, filed a legal homestead claim, driven a wagon across Kansas alone, built a cabin from the ground up in October, and just outmaneuvered a land swindler by inventing a fictional attorney in real time. "Catherine," he said. "Yes." He could not think of what to say. What he felt was too large for the room. "Nothing," he said. "I'll ride to Whitfield tomorrow." He rode to Whitfield the next morning, and the land agent confirmed what Raymond had said. Catherine Grady's claim was properly filed and fully in order. Whitfield provided a written confirmation on official paper with his seal, and wrote a separate letter to the sheriff identifying Drummond by name as engaged in fraudulent activity, which had in fact been reported by 2 other settlers in the past month. Raymond brought both documents to Catherine that afternoon, and she read them with the focused precision she brought to everything written, and when she finished she set them down and said, "Good," and put them in the ledger book for safekeeping. "That's it," Raymond said. "What else would there be?" she said. "It is resolved. I do not find it useful to dwell on things once they are resolved." She paused. "I will admit that I found it alarming in the moment when Drummond was standing in my doorway. I was aware of being alone here with 3 children and a man with wrong intentions." She said this carefully. "That is not a feeling I enjoy." "You handled it well," he said. "I handled it adequately," she corrected. "I prefer to not need to handle it at all." He looked at her. "If anything like that happens again, you can send Eli to me. He knows the way." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I know that I can. That is one of the things I have allowed myself to know." This was, from Catherine Grady, an enormous admission, and Raymond received it with the careful respect it deserved and did not press any further. Christmas came and went in that small way that frontier winters allow it, simply and without extravagance. Raymond had brought gifts that were useful. A proper hunting knife for Eli, which the boy received with the exact combination of gratitude and reverence that a 10-year-old gives to a knife that treats him as capable of handling one. A good leather-bound arithmetic book for Thomas, who had revealed a passion for numbers. And for Henry, a small carved wooden horse that Raymond had made on the winter evenings when there was nothing else for his hands to do. Henry immediately named the horse Raymond, which caused a silence around the cabin, and then Catherine laughed her real laugh again, the one that stopped hearts, and Eli grinned, and Thomas said solemnly that it was a good name for a horse, and Raymond felt the warmth of that room move through him like something had been restored. Catherine gave Raymond a pair of thick wool socks she had knitted, and a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a copy she had made of the Marta Svensson pamphlet, in her own careful handwriting, annotated in the margins with her own additional observations. It was the most personal gift anyone had given him in years, and he held it longer than was probably strictly appropriate. "It seemed like something you'd use," she said, slightly self-conscious for the first time he had seen. "I will," he said, and he meant it for reasons beyond the agricultural content. January was the hardest month, as January in Kansas always is. The cold was absolute, and the wind came off the plains like something with a grievance, and Raymond spent 3 nights at the Grady cabin during a blizzard that came without sufficient warning and made the road impassable, sleeping in the corner of the main room wrapped in his coat with a spare blanket Catherine provided without being asked. Those 3 days of enforced proximity were different from the voluntary evenings. There was a domestic quality to being snowed in together that made everything feel simultaneously more natural and more significant. Raymond repaired a cracked chair leg and oiled all the hinges while Catherine made bread, and Thomas ran complicated arithmetic problems on his slate, and Henry built elaborate structures with pieces of wood scrap, and narrated each one in detail to anyone willing to listen. And Eli read from the small collection of books Catherine had brought from Wichita. On the second evening of the blizzard, after the boys were asleep, Raymond and Catherine sat by the fire, and there was a new quality to the silence between them, a comfortable weight to it, the silence of people who have been in enough situations together that they do not need to fill every moment with words. "I have been thinking," Catherine said. "About what?" She looked at the fire. "About what I want," she said carefully. "Not just the claim, the land, the boys' futures, those things I have always known." She paused. "I mean about what I want in a larger sense, whether I am allowing myself to consider things beyond the immediate." He waited. "I was not unhappy with Daniel," she said the first time she had used her husband's name. "He was a gentle man and he loved me and I loved him in the way of people who have grown into each other over years. But I was never—" She stopped and considered the word she wanted. "I was never known by him in the way I mean. He did not understand the way I think. He was patient with it and kind, but he did not follow it, and after a time I stopped trying to explain certain things because the effort of translation outweighed the value." She looked at Raymond. "I have not experienced that problem lately." Raymond held her gaze. The fire settled. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the cabin walls and found no way in. "No," he said, "you haven't." "I notice that," she said. "I am aware that I notice it." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking at her across the fire. "Catherine," he said, "I am not a man who performs feelings I don't have. I want you to know that." He paused. "I also want you to know that what I feel is real, and it has been building since the morning I found you at my fence line. And I have been trying not to crowd you with it, because I thought you needed time and space more than you needed my feelings in your general direction." She looked at him with those dark green steady eyes. "And now?" "Now I'm snowed in your cabin for the third day," he said. "And I think that what you just said to me was as close to a declaration as you are probably comfortable making first, so I am making the rest of it." He held her gaze. "I love you, Catherine. I do not say it lightly. I have not said it to anyone since 1863, and I am well aware of what the word means." The fire, the wind, the sleeping children, the annotated pamphlet in his saddlebag, the axle he had repaired 4 months ago that had started all of this. Catherine reached across the space between them and took his hand. She turned it over in both of her hands and looked at it as if reading something in it, and then she held it. "I'm not ready to say everything," she said quietly. "Not yet, but I want you to know that I am not far from it." "That's enough," he said. "That is entirely enough." They sat together at the fire with her hands around his, and the blizzard did not get in, and the night was very long and very warm, and it was the best night Raymond Thatcher had spent in 4 years on the Kansas plains. February came in with a brief thaw that raised everyone's spirits falsely, as February thaws always do, followed by another hard freeze. Raymond began to ride to the claim every day now, and there was no pretense about the axle or neighborly courtesy. He simply went because it was where he wanted to be, and Catherine opened the door when she heard his horse, and the coffee was already on the stove, and this had become the shape of things. The boys had adjusted to his presence in their distinct individual ways. Henry had been immediate and total in his adoption of Raymond as a regular feature of his world, the way small children accept things that are good without needing to negotiate terms. Thomas had taken longer, and his acceptance came in the form of one morning when he brought Raymond his arithmetic slate and asked him to check his work, which Raymond did with full seriousness, and found 1 error in the long division and 2 in the geometry problems, and explained each one. And Thomas nodded gravely and corrected them. And after that, Thomas would sometimes sit near Raymond in the evenings and do his studying within earshot, which was Thomas's version of closeness. Eli was the most considered. He was 10 years old and the eldest, and he had understood for some time that his father was gone, and that his mother was a person with needs that went beyond what he could provide, and this understanding lived in him with a seriousness beyond his years. He watched Raymond for weeks with that frank assessment that was so like Catherine's, watching how Raymond treated her, watching whether the word matched the action. And one afternoon in February he came to Raymond while Raymond was working on a sled runner he was repairing and said, "Do you plan to stay?" Raymond set down his tools. He looked at the boy directly, the way the question deserved. "I plan to be here as long as your mother will have me," he said, "and I intend to do everything I can to make sure she wants to keep having me." He paused. "I am not going to make promises to you that are your mother's to accept or refuse, but I can tell you that I am not a man who leaves, and I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean." Eli looked at him for a long moment with those green eyes. Then he said, "All right," and picked up the other end of the sled runner to hold it steady, and that was that. In March, when the thaw came in earnest and the prairie began to show the first green at the roots, and the mud season arrived in all its miserable glory, Raymond came to the claim on a Tuesday afternoon and found Catherine standing outside looking at her planting field with the particular expression she wore when she was planting something large. "I need to break that ground before the last frost," she said when he came to stand beside her. 3 acres, maybe 3.5. Wheat in the east section, kitchen garden close to the house, and I want to try something. "What?" "I want to put in a small apple orchard." She pointed to the south-facing slope at the lower end of the claim. "Right there, protected from the north, good sun exposure, reasonable drainage. 6 trees to start." She looked at him. "The pamphlet says apple trees take 3 years to produce, so starting now means I have fruit by the time Henry is 7. Raymond looked at the slope. He looked at her, this woman planting fruit trees for a son who was currently 4 years old, planting patience and hope into the same ground she was planning to feed her family from, and something in him arrived at a place of perfect certainty. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. She turned to look at him. She read his expression and her own became careful and attentive. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what we are building here." He made a slight gesture that encompassed the cabin, the fields, the slope where the apple trees would go. "And I would like for it to be formally and properly shared." "Raymond, let me say it," he said. "I am not being impulsive. I have been thinking about this since December, and I have been waiting until the right moment, and I have decided there is no perfect moment, so I am making this the moment." He looked at her steadily. "Catherine Grady, I would like to marry you, if you will have me. I want to share this land and this work and these boys and whatever else comes. I am asking clearly and without conditions and with everything I have." The prairie wind came through, soft and warm with the first real spring in it, and Catherine's hair moved in it, and she looked at Raymond Thatcher standing on her land with his hat in his hand and his heart in his face, and she was quiet for a long moment. "You fixed my axle," she said. He blinked. "I did. And then you came back," she looked at him, "and you kept coming back. And you never made me feel like a problem to be solved or a charity case or something that needed managing." She paused. "You just came back and worked and talked to me like I was someone worth talking to." "You are," he said simply. She stepped toward him and took his face in both hands, which was not what he had expected, and she kissed him, which was also not quite what he had expected, though it was entirely what he had hoped for, and it was a real kiss, deliberate and present with all of Catherine's characteristic completeness. When she stepped back, she was looking at him with something openly luminous in her face, the composure entirely gone, and he thought she was the most beautiful thing he had seen in his life. "Yes," she said. "Raymond Thatcher, yes." He put his arms around her and held her there in the March sunlight on the Kansas prairie, with the planting fields ahead of them, and the apple tree slope waiting and the cabin solid at their backs, and he felt the specific joy of a person who has come back from a long absence to a place they belong. Henry came around the corner of the cabin at that moment, followed closely by Thomas, and they both stopped and stared at their mother being embraced by Raymond. Henry considered this situation for approximately 2 seconds and then announced, "Good," with the authority of a child who has decided that the universe is proceeding correctly. Thomas looked at them both with his serious face. "Does this mean Raymond is staying?" he asked. "Yes," Catherine said, "it does." Thomas gave the small, precise nod that was his version of great happiness. "I have a new geometry problem I need checked," he said, and went back inside. Eli appeared last, having come from the barn. He took in the scene and looked at his mother and then at Raymond, and something in his face settled, some long-held tension releasing quietly. He did not say anything. He just nodded, the way Raymond had nodded at Eli, one craftsman to another acknowledging good work, and went back to what he had been doing. They were married in May, in Harlow's Creek, in the small whitewashed church that had been built 2 years earlier with community labor. James Whitfield, the land agent, and his wife attended, and Marcus Bellamy was there, and Doc Hendricks and Doris Henshaw, the schoolteacher, and most of the small settlement's families. Eli stood beside Raymond as the ring was placed, and Thomas read a Bible verse in his careful, serious voice, and Henry fell asleep on a church pew 3 minutes before the ceremony ended and had to be carried out by Raymond, which he did without a moment's hesitation, and which caused several of the older women present to press handkerchiefs to their eyes. Catherine wore a dress of pale blue wool that she had made herself, and she carried a bunch of prairie wildflowers that Henry had gathered that morning with help from Eli, who had directed his younger brother to specific flowers with the same systematic attention he brought to everything. And she was so precisely herself that Raymond could not look away from her for the entirety of the ceremony. They returned to the claim afterward, which had in the weeks preceding the wedding expanded significantly. Raymond had begun the formal process of combining his holdings with Catherine's, a legal undertaking that James Whitfield helped them navigate, and had moved his equipment and stock to the Grady claim, leaving his original homestead in good order with a young family named Pierce who were coming out from Ohio and needed a place to start from. The move had been decided mutually, practically, because Catherine's land was better positioned, with the spring water and the timber stand, and the south-facing slope where the 6 apple trees were now in the ground, small and hopeful. Raymond's original cabin would carry the Pierce family through their first year, and the Pierces would pay him a nominal lease until they could file their own claim. It was a clean arrangement that satisfied everyone, and Catherine had reviewed the terms and made 3 suggestions that improved them, which Raymond had implemented without argument, and which Whitfield had complimented as remarkably clear thinking. The summer of 1879 was a working summer, which is the only kind that counts on the frontier. The wheat went in on schedule and came up clean and even, and Catherine's kitchen garden was the most organized piece of ground Raymond had ever seen, planted in rows so precise they looked measured by instrument, which they had been, because Catherine had built herself a simple marking frame from scrap wood for exactly this purpose. The apple trees leafed out and looked like they intended to live, which apple trees in Kansas did not always, and Catherine checked them with a proprietary attention that Raymond found entirely endearing. Eli went to school in Harlow's Creek 3 days a week, riding the claim horse with the ease of a boy who had been born on the back of one, and Doris Henshaw sent home a note in June that said simply, "This boy should go to college," which Catherine kept in the back of the ledger book and took out sometimes and read in a particular way. Thomas's arithmetic advanced to the point where Raymond genuinely could not find errors in his long division, and he told Thomas this plainly, and Thomas said that he had been thinking about engineering, which in 1879 was a word that sat between a trade and a dream, and Raymond said that he thought that was a very fine thing to think about. Henry turned 5 in July and began to develop strong opinions about horses, specifically about which horses were good and which were not, and his assessments, delivered with the confidence of someone who has been consulting on this matter for years, turned out to be more often right than wrong, which Raymond found remarkable and Catherine found entirely expected. On a Wednesday evening in August, Catherine closed the ledger book that was now considerably larger, having added many pages, and looked at Raymond across the table and said, I am going to have a baby." Raymond set down his coffee cup. "I know," she said calmly. The timing is wonderful," he said. She looked at him. "We are not financially settled enough to be certain of, Catherine," he said. "The timing is wonderful." She stopped. She looked at him, and the composure wavered in the way it only wavered for real and large things, and she said, very quietly, "Yes, it is." He came around the table and put his arms around her from behind, her sitting in the rocking chair that had been the first furniture in the cabin, and he held her there in the August evening with the windows open and the smell of the wheat coming in warm and dry from the fields. "4 boys," she said. "Maybe not," he said. She tilted her head back against his shoulder. "What do you mean, maybe not? Boys run in." "We'll see," he said. "We'll see what comes." What came in late March of 1880, after a labor that Doc Hendricks described as efficient, because Catherine even managed labor efficiently, was a boy. A red-faced, emphatic boy who announced his arrival at considerable volume and did not stop for some time. Eli held him first after Catherine, with a careful precision that was so adult it made Raymond's throat close. Thomas looked at his new brother with the expression of a scientist encountering a new phenomenon. Henry looked at him for approximately 30 seconds and then said that the baby looked like a potato and went to check on the horses, which was Henry. Raymond held the baby last, sitting in the rocking chair where Catherine had spent so many evenings, and the baby looked up at him with the unfocused dark eyes of the newborn, and Raymond held him with the care of a man who knows what he is holding. "What will you name him?" Doc Hendricks asked from the doorway, pulling on his coat. Raymond looked at Catherine, who looked back at him. "Daniel," she said. "After his grandfather." She paused. "His first grandfather." Raymond nodded. "Daniel," he agreed. "Daniel James Thatcher." Catherine had thought he might feel something complicated about the name, some tug of pride or displacement, and he felt neither, because the name honored what had come before, and what had come before had led here. And Raymond Thatcher was not a man who failed to see the logic of that. The wheat harvest of 1880 was the best in the Harlows Creek area, and the Thatcher claim, which was what people called it, though the deeds showed Thatcher and Grady Thatcher both produced enough to cover their expenses, pay off the last of the supply's debt, and put a small amount aside. It was not wealth. It was sufficiency, which on the frontier is its own category of miracle. In September, with the harvest in and the accounts settled, Raymond and Catherine sat on the step of the cabin in the evening watching the boys in the yard, Eli showing Henry something about the rope mechanism that he had finally perfected, Thomas doing sums on his slate in the last of the light, baby Daniel on a blanket between them, and the sky went the enormous gold and red and orange of a Kansas sunset, painting the whole world in the specific colors of the end of a good day. Catherine leaned her head against Raymond's shoulder. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the fact that I came to your fence line with a broken axle and 3 children and no particular plan beyond getting to my land," she said. "And you fixed the axle before you said more than 20 words to me." "The axle needed fixing," he said. "It did," she agreed. "And I was glad of it." She paused. "But I have been thinking that fixing the axle was the easy part." He looked at her. "What was the hard part?" She was quiet for a moment, watching Henry attempt to explain the rope mechanism to baby Daniel, who was paying close attention to a grass blade. "Letting someone in," she said. "Deciding that needing help was not the same as being helpless. Deciding that being known by someone was worth the risk of it." She looked at Raymond. "That took considerably longer than 2 hours." He put his arm around her. "How long?" She thought about it with her characteristic exactness. "November," she said. "The night you told me you were not a man who performs feelings he doesn't have. That was when I knew." She paused. "The rest was just working up to the certainty of what I already knew." "November," he said. "That is when I knew too." "We are well matched," she said. "Yes," he said. "We are." Henry had abandoned the rope mechanism and was now running in large circles for no discernible reason, as small boys will. Thomas had put his slate away and was looking at the sunset with a calm appreciation. Eli sat near the fence with his rope project in his lap, and his face turned up to the sky, and in the fading light he looked older than his 11 years. This boy who had eaten Raymond's dried venison on the first morning and worked beside him without being asked, and who had asked him one straight question on a February afternoon and accepted the straight answer. Daniel made a decisive sound on his blanket and grabbed a fistful of grass and examined it. "He has your eyes," Raymond said, looking at the baby. "He has your jaw," Catherine said. "He has his grandfather's name." "And his father's hands," she said, and looked at Raymond's hands, large and calloused and capable, and she covered them with her own. The sun went down behind the western horizon, taking all that gold and red with it, and the first stars appeared in the east, and the Thatcher land lay quiet and worked and full of its own life around them, the wheat stubble silver in the darkening, the apple trees on the south slope, 6 small shapes against the fading light, the cabin with its double north wall and its stone chimney solid and permanent, the spring at the northeast corner running clear and cold. Thomas began to read aloud from his primer, his voice steady and precise in the evening air. Eli put a hand on Henry's shoulder to slow him as he ran past, and Henry slowed and then sat beside his oldest brother with the ease of long habit. Baby Daniel decided the grass blade was satisfactory and released it and looked at the sky. Raymond Thatcher, who had come to Kansas in 1874 to build something solid and his own in the aftermath of everything loss could do to a person, who had spent 4 years in a silence that he had mistaken for contentment, who had walked through a fence gate on an October morning in 1878 toward a woman with her hands on her hips and 3 boys looking over the side of a wagon, who had fixed an axle before he said more than necessary, who had known in November what the rest of his life was going to look like. Raymond Thatcher sat on the step of a cabin that was better than anything he could have built alone, with a woman who was the finest person he had ever known leaning against his shoulder, and was complete. Catherine would send Eli to the Harlow's Creek School the following September, and Doris Henshaw would repeat in December that the boy should go to college, and eventually he would, to Lawrence, on a scholarship that required significant correspondence and effort from both his mother and Raymond. And he would study engineering and come home in the summers and stand on the south slope and look at the apple trees that were now producing their first real fruit, and he would be proud in a quiet way. Thomas would become a surveyor, because the land needed measuring and he was excellent at measuring things, and he would come back to help survey the Harlow's Creek area expansion in the 1890s and stand on land he had been a child on and feel the particular satisfaction of knowing the shape of a place down to its inches. Henry would work horses his whole life, as everyone who knew him at 4 years old could have predicted, and eventually he would have a small horse operation on the eastern end of the property where he had always spent his time, and his assessments of horseflesh would be sought out by people from 2 counties over. Daniel James Thatcher would grow up knowing nothing but the full life of the claim, with his mother's precision and his father's patience, and the memory of 4 older brothers shaping his world from the beginning, and he would take over the farming operation from Raymond with the ease of someone inheriting something that had always also been his. The apple trees would produce. The wheat would come in year after year through the droughts and the good years, and the difficult years that the prairie deals out in its own accounting. The spring would run clear, the cabin would stand. And in the evenings of many years, Catherine Grady Thatcher would sit on the step of the cabin with the ledger book in her lap, updated and annotated. Things I have not figured out yet, growing shorter over time as the figured out things grew many, and Raymond would sit beside her, and the Kansas sky would do what it always does at sunset, which is become unreasonably beautiful, and they would be there for all of it. This man and this woman who had started with a broken axle on an October morning and had built everything they needed from that cracked and humble beginning. He had fixed the axle first. His heart had taken considerably longer and had held considerably better, and had not required a single repair in all the years that followed.